Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And today is one of those days, in a sense, I live for, to have somebody come in who lives here, works here, and writes, and is successful. The name of that person is David Vann, and he is going to talk about his newest book and his first novel called Caribou Island, published by Harper. Welcome aboard. It's great to have you.
Thanks a lot.
I'm looking at the notes about you. You're quite a guy. It says here, Vann has been called, quote, a truly great writer. And this by the Irish Sunday Independent. You got stuff there. And, quote, one of the best writers of his generation, Le Figaro. Anybody over here like you, or are you just big in Europe?
That's very funny.
And it says here that you are an American writer, of course,
right.
with an international reputation. You've been a bestseller on 2 continents. You have won the Grace Paley Prize and California Book Award. California Book Award, who gives that?
It's the Commonwealth Association here in San Francisco.
Yeah, okay, right.
Yeah, that's great. They give awards to a range of books every year.
And there's money involved in their awards, is there not?
There's very little money involved in most book awards. It's really just
we got to change that.
Great, the acknowledgement.
That's good. And and outside this country, you won something called Le Prix des Lecteurs de l'Express in France, and been shortlisted for the Sunday Times Short Story Award in the UK. You had a collection of stories called Legend of a Suicide.
That's right.
You told me before we came into the studio that that's a collection of short stories, and it's available still here in this country, I assume, and over there. But it's also one of the stories in it is available freestanding.
Yeah, it's a short novel titled Caribou Island, and then framed by 5 stories. And in many European countries, they publish it on its own as a novel. But here, it's included in Legend of a Suicide.
And that's available.
Yeah.
Is that published by Harper also?
Yeah, it's published by Harper in paperback, and it has a boy and his father going homesteading for a year in southeast Alaska, and it's based on the true story of my father's suicide when I was 13. And there's an enormous surprise halfway through that happens. It was the first time I experienced that in fiction, where the story took off in its own direction, and there's all this pattern that was out of control and unconscious, and the story kind of demanding its own way to be told. And that's what I ended up following in Caribou Island also. I kept returning to the place, to this beautiful landscape in Alaska where I grew up. And if I kept focusing on the place, that would tell me who the characters were and what was happening. I worked in the same way with both books, in that I had true family stories in the background, and I was focusing on the Alaskan landscape in the foreground. Where I grew up in Ketchikan is incredibly beautiful. It's rainforest, and the forest is so thick, there's so much deadfall and so much undergrowth that when I would run through the forest as a kid, I could actually fall through and disappear and hit a second floor. And it was just...
No, let's go slow now. You're running through the forest as a kid, probably with bare feet.
Right, and afraid of bears and wolves, which we had in the forest.
Yeah.
And I could actually fall through. There's so much growth that had built up that you'd think you were running on the floor, but you could fall through into a space between that and the real floor.
Yeah.
And so it was a place that was mysterious and mythic, I think, because I spent my childhood there. My first couple of years of memories are there, and then I was plucked away here to California, and so they were preserved as this mythic, strange place that changes and shifts when put under pressure. When I'm writing about it, it seems to pretty easily start to indicate the inside lives of the characters, and so I try to work through landscape.
Oh, this was the case in developing this book. It says somewhere in the notes that you had some things of which you were very, very sure, but you couldn't pull it all together. And again, it was back to Alaska to do that, I guess.
Right. I have these family stories in the background which are really confusing and upsetting. In Caribou Island, in the background, there's the murder-suicide of my stepmother's parents. Her father told her mother told his wife that the last 15 years of marriage had been a lie in some ways, and he had an affair with another woman, and he was moving on, and they'd had a lot of problems for a long time. And she wrote suicide notes to everyone, including to him, and didn't plan to kill him, but at the end changed her mind and killed him before killing herself. And so that was such a disturbing thing from when I was 12 years old, and it came 11 months before my father killed himself while talking on the phone with my stepmother. And so it was connected to that for me also. So it's something I was trying to understand, but I moved it from California to Alaska, and I don't really remember her parents well, so these characters have become something else here. But what I love about fiction is that it takes these true family stories and transforms them into something else. And there's something wonderfully redemptive about that.
Yeah. And particularly when you're talking about family stories of this kind. Mm-hmm. It's not, Uncle Paul had a great farm and discovered a new pea.
No, these ones, it's nice to have a second chance on these stories.
Well, we've been talking mostly here in this first segment about the background of the author and the background of the book. And believe it or not, when we come back, we'll start talking more about Caribou Island. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
David Vann, he's an author. He's involved with the graduate writing program at the University of San Francisco, and he's internationally honored. And he's also honored by the New York Times Book Review, who, in evaluating the book, said in part, Caribou Island gets to places other novels can't touch. By the end, I felt the senseless logic of the dream. Though it wears the clothes of realism, the beautiful exactness of the language, the unerring eye for detail, it takes us someplace darker, older, more powerful than the daylit world. This is a whole other riff on what we bandy about all the time, the phrase noir. Mm-hmm. And I would never say noir about this. I would say dark, period. It's just dark. It takes us someplace darker, older, more powerful than the daylit world. This Alaska, with its salmon boats and trash dumps, becomes a stage for ancient stories of survival and will and connection and love, and also, in the end, the failures of love. Strong poison. That's great stuff. I mean, who was this fellow? Kevin Canty. Is he a brother reviewer?
You have to love a reviewer like that. I haven't met him before, I swear. He's not my cousin or something.
Not your cousin.
But yeah, they've been so generous and supportive for the last book, for Legend of a Suicide also, and now for Caribou Island.
Well, you were in a very enviable place. If somebody like the New York Times falls in love with you, it's a wonderful relationship to have.
They actually changed my life completely with the review of Legend of a Suicide. Mm-hmm. It came out with a university press. For 12 years, no agent would send it to editors. I thought it would never be published. And it had only 3 reviews in the U.S., including the San Francisco Chronicle here, who was great and supportive also. But that New York Times review changed my life because it led to a bigger publisher, Harper, picking up that book and then Caribou Island, and led to these foreign rights. And now it's coming out in 16 languages. And it's unbelievable to me. It's such a dream. And it's all because of that one great review. It has such power.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the things that this great reviewer says about Caribou Island is that it takes us places other novels can't touch. And I read that to say that it takes us to Alaska in a way that other novels can't touch. Do you see that too? Do you see Alaska somehow as a character here?
I think Alaska does become a character in Caribou Island. I think wilderness is a place where we put our dreams and where we imagine that we could reshape our lives and become something else and become something better. And I think we imagine with wilderness, especially Alaska, a kind of self-sufficiency, a kind of goodness, resourcefulness. And Gary, in the novel has gone to Alaska for this reason. He'd like to reshape his life and imagine who he's going to be. But in fact, he's running from something. He was in a PhD program at Berkeley and knew that he wasn't going to make the grade and was really running away. And Irene, who's the main character of the book, didn't realize that in time. She thought they were just going up there on vacation, and this became her life. And it becomes frightening to her, the momentum of her life, what's happened in this 30 years of marriage, that she's ended up staying up there and ended up becoming a different person than she had imagined, and with a different kind of marriage.
Also, to me, she seems to have no control over her life. It's totally dominated by Gary.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the way I read it. I don't know. I kept saying to myself, why don't you tell him to go to hell and change, or I'm leaving.
Right. Well, she's actually caught in a tough place where she's just retired from teaching, and she misses work, and her 2 kids are grown and gone, and she's finding that this marriage that she thought was solid is there's nothing solid about it. Yeah. Like a sense of self. She can't match who she is now with who she was 5 years ago or 20 years ago. She also has her mother's suicide from 45 years ago when she was 10. And that's an event she tried to erase and make not happen and deny. And now that seems like a shame. She'd like to recover her childhood and remember who she was.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on. And I think Alaska, as you said, as a character, puts a lot of force and pressure on these characters. They're alone in the wilderness. There's no distraction, no escape. And the wilderness is like a giant mirror that amplifies. And everything that's not going well is coming at them from the wilderness.
Her husband, Gary, you call at one point in the novel an impatient man, and impatient with the larger shape of his life, with who he was and what he'd done and become, impatient with his wife and his children. This guy is like never going to be satisfied, it seems.
Yeah, one thing strange about...
And he's looking for this rebirth in Alaska, which he sees and a lot of people see as a place of hope and rebirth and renewal. We'll get it straightened out here in Alaska.
Right.
Doesn't happen.
And as I mentioned elsewhere in the book, a lot of what Alaska are these tiny towns that are these toeholds in wilderness, and they're enclaves of despair. I wrote in the book, is my actual experience of Alaska, that a lot of dreams have gone wrong and been disappointing there. Gary, one thing strange about writing this novel is that I didn't realize till 6 months after I'd written it that I was really Irene in a lot of ways, the main character. And I actually didn't realize that when I was writing it, but I realized I was also Gary, too, and that I have his same kind of sense that I can just go out and he's going to build this cabin on the island and it's just going to work out without any plans or advice welcome. And I've been like that, too, and I've had his impatience and his vacancy also.
There's this scene in the book where... The two of them are on the island, and the parameters of the cabin are now laid out. And she says, where's the fireplace?
Right. She wants something a little bigger, a little more comfortable.
She says, there's no place to sit down. Right. She says, where's the bathroom?
Right.
And you know that, he's going for this kind of dream, I guess.
Right.
And she's, as so often happens, is being the practical one. The woman saying, where will we sit? Where the heck is the bathroom?
Yeah, it turns out there's really no place for her in the dream.
That's right. There is no place for her. Well, we have a place for Irene on this program, and we're going to keep talking about her because she's great.
Thank you.
She's great. And we will return very, very shortly with more about Irene and more about Caribou Island.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Conversations on the Coast, and we're talking today to a San Francisco treasure, David Vann. Wins a lot of prizes, teaches at USF, and writes great novels.
Thank
The
you.
novel that we're talking about is his debut novel. It's called Caribou Island, published by Harper. And I always like, if it's appropriate, to give the listeners a sense of the writing. And I think one of the ways with your book is to do the opening.
Great. Yeah,
And
I'd be
then
happy
go
to
on
read.
to something else. Would you do that for us?
Sure, yeah.
Thanks.
So this is the opening, Irene speaking to her daughter Rhoda. My mother was not real. She was an early dream, a hope. She was a place, snowy like here and cold, a wooden house on a hill above a river. An overcast day, the old white paint of the buildings made brighter somehow by the trapped light, and I was coming home from school. 10 years old, walking by myself, walking through dirty patches of snow in the yard, walking up to the narrow porch. I can't remember how my thoughts went then, can't remember who I was or what I felt like. All of that is gone, erased. I opened our front door and found my mother hanging from the rafters. I'm sorry, I said, and I stepped back and closed the door. I was outside on the porch again. You said that? Rhoda asked. You said you were sorry? Yes. Oh, Mom. It was long ago, Irene said, and it was something I couldn't see even at the time, so I can't see it now. I don't know what she looked like hanging there. I don't remember any of it, only that it was. Rhoda scooted closer on the couch and put her arm around her mother, pulled her close. They both looked at the fire. A metal screen in front, small hexagons, and the longer Rhoda looked, the more these hexagons seemed like the back wall of the fireplace, made golden by flame, as if the back wall, black with soot, could be revealed or transmuted by fire. Then her eyes would shift, and it would be only a screen again. I wish I had known her, Rhoda said. Me too, Irene said. She patted Rhoda's knee. I need to get to sleep. Busy day tomorrow. I'll miss this place. It was a good home, but your father wants to leave me, and the first step is to make us move out to that island, to make it seem he gave it a try. That's not true, Mom. We all have rules, Rhoda, and your father's main rule is that he can never seem like the bad guy. He loves you, Mom. Irene stood and hugged her daughter. Good night, Rhoda.
That's a pretty dark opening, I think. But on your back jacket, a fellow by the name of Robert Olin Butler, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of A Good Scent from a Strange Mountain, says something about your writing that we need to share at this moment. It's rare when a fiction writer of extraordinary literary merit is equally brilliant as both the short story both the short story and novel forms. David Vann is a dazzling exception. Caribou Island is deeply in touch with the same dark truths of the human condition as his remarkable story collection, Legend of a Suicide. And in the longer form, he gives the reader sustained, rich joy. Yes, joy. Vann knows the darkness, but he writes from the compassionate light of art. This is an essential book. So that's what you get here. This is not noir. It's beyond that. It's something quite different. And to give our friends out there a sense of that balance, could you read a little bit from another section?
Sure. This is Irene, a vision of winter on the lake, Skilak Lake, where Caribou Island is set. Irene lay alone in her tent, a quieter night than usual, no wind, and she tried to imagine what it would be like in winter. Not so hard to do, really, after living at the edge of this lake so many years. As she walked out onto it, she'd find fault lines in the snow, a thin dusting, faint ridges raised up where the ice had cracked. No other footsteps, no tracks of any kind. Irene the only figure on a broad pan of white. Early winter, the temperature -15. The mountains would be white, the lake and glacier, only the sky a new color, rare winter sun, rare midwinter blue, the sun above the peaks moving sideways, unable to rise any higher. Irene would carry her bow, her footsteps the only sound, the world prehistoric, wind shifting the snow like sand, small dunes and hollows, the water close beneath. Irene imagined herself not properly dressed for the cold for some reason, wearing what she had worn inside the cabin, finished now, a blue sweater, thin-down vest, wool pants and boots, a knit cap, white and gray, no gloves. Her hand holding the bow was cold. She walked toward the glacier, toward the mountains, away from the island, walked slowly, then stopped and looked around. Without her footsteps, no sound, no wind, no moving water, no bird, no other human, this bright world. The sound of her heart, the sound of her own breath, the sound of her own blood in her temples, those were all she would hear. If she could make those stop, she could hear the world. The water beneath her was moving, and that must make a sound. A dark current beneath ice, no surface to break, no ripples, but even that must make a sound. Deep water, layers and currents, and when one layer moved over another, something must hear that, some tearing of water against water. And over time, the changes in those currents, the shifts, the lake never the same from moment to moment, all of that must be recorded somehow. Irene could imagine herself continuing on over the thin crust, holding the bow in her left hand, letting the other hand warm in her pocket, continuing over light dunes of snow, pausing in an area of large flakes, the size of fingernails, individual snowflakes, their branches visible, lying at angles, razor-thin. They looked ornamental, contrived, too large and individual to be real. She squatted down for a closer look, touched a flake, then wiped her hand across the surface, revealing the black of the lake, the color of ice over the depths, a vacuum of light, and no way to peer into it, the surface clear but so dark as to be essentially opaque.
Wow. Wow. That's really seeing a place in a very different way, in an artistic way, as the reviewer says, and bringing great pleasure to us, the readers.
Thank you.
The voice is David Vann. The book is Caribou Island. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.